Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. We're going to do a mini PC review today with the Beelink SER8, and I've been covering Beelink mini PCs for years. They're one of my favorite manufacturers. I love the fact that they have budget models that you can find for around $150, and then the high-end stuff like the one we're reviewing today, which is around $650. But the cool thing is they continue to sell all of their older products, and so if you go on Amazon, you'll often find sales for the older ones, and so depending on what your budget is, you can usually find something that's going to be a really great fit. Now at first glance, the SER8 doesn't really appear to be very special. It doesn't have any sort of high-end feature to it or any sort of gimmick. It's just a basic mini PC. But over the past month or so of testing it, I found it to be rock solid and have all of the little features that are really important to me when talking about a smaller form factor like this. And so I've come to think of this small and unassuming mini PC as being basically peak within the space right now. It's got the best chip you can find with integrated graphics, and the combination of cooling and performance in this little box is just about perfect. So in this video, we're going to do a wide range of testing, from everyday PC tasks and video editing, all the way to PC gaming, as well as, of course, a bunch of emulation. We got a lot of stuff to cover, and I'm going to have a lot of fun doing it. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's get started with specs, particularly when it comes to CPU, graphics, and RAM. And the SER8 has the current generation 8000 series processor from AMD, the Ryzen 7 8845HS. That's going to have a max turbo frequency of 5.1 GHz and has 8 cores and 16 threads. Now this generation's integrated graphics are going to be the same as we saw last year in the 7000 series, so it's going to be the AMD Radeon 780M. And so that is the same GPU that you will find in devices like the Asus ROG Ally and others. And finally, in terms of RAM, it's dual channel DDR5 running at 5600 megatransfers per second. Now, one thing of note here with this Ryzen CPU, like I mentioned before, it is very similar to last generation's processor. It has a couple additional AI features to it, but for the most part, when it comes to the testing we'll be doing in this video, it's going to be much as the same as we saw last year. In fact, if we do a comparison between this year's and last year's model, you will see that, yeah, they're just about neck and neck. Even on nanoreview.net, the only key difference that they stipulate is that one is newer than the other. And so even though we are going to test every little thing, we're not going to see a big bump in performance here at all. However, one of the things I think that sets apart the SER8 is just the overall design when it comes to the I/O. And again, we're not seeing any sort of special feature, but I just think that the way that they've put everything together is really well thought out. So let's start by looking at the I/O on the back and what this all really means. To start, we have 4 different USB ports. We've got 3 USB-A ports of varying speed from USB 2.0 to USB 3.2. And then our 1 USB-C port on the back is 40 gigabits per second, so it's a full USB 4. And this is perfect because that's going to be the plug that you would use for something that's really high speed, like an external GPU. And for me personally, I think that a plug like that should be on the back, so it's kind of out of the way. And finally, the other plugs on the back are pretty self-explanatory. 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, as well as DisplayPort 1.4 capable of 4K and 144 Hz, and then HDMI 2.1 again at 4K but 120 Hz. And so just in terms of general I/O, I think that every port that I would want is here on the back, and I think that's really great from a design perspective. And as icing on top, we've got a headphone jack on the back, which will allow us to plug in things like speakers, again keeping them out of the way. Now looking over the front, we've got really good design here again. We've got another headphone jack on the front. That's going to be great if you want to plug in headphones. And then we've got 2 other USB ports, both capable of 10 gigabits per second. One's USB-C, the other is USB-A. And I think, again, this is a great move because that means it's going to have pretty fast data transfer if you're going to plug in an external hard drive. But then if you're just going to be plugging in, for example, a wired Xbox controller, you can just plug this in really conveniently without having to go around and search in the back. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about great I/O design. I've been testing this computer for about a month at this point, and all the ports have been exactly where I want them to be when I want them. Okay, next let's talk a little bit about price and buying options. So you can get this directly on Beelink's website, and the retail price is $649. There are no other RAM and storage options, at least available on their website, but you do have 2 different color options. You have a lighter one and then a darker gray. Now, because it took me so darn long to get this review done, this is already up on Amazon as well. You'll see that initially it might say $750, but there is a $100 coupon, so it's going to bring it down to that $650 as well. And if you are watching this video down the line, I expect that this price is going to get even lower and lower, but we're going to judge it right now just on that $650 price point. So let's go ahead and move into the unboxing and talk about what you will get inside. First up, you will get a small booklet, which will give you a quick startup guide in terms of just getting everything plugged in, and it'll also tell you how to upgrade some of the components. Also in the box, we get a power supply. This is relatively small in terms of power supply standards, and it is a barrel plug and 100 watts altogether. And finally, we have a small HDMI cable, and that's about it. Now, taking a look at the mini PC itself, my first impression is just I love the fact that it's all made out of one big piece of aluminum. It gives it a very Mac Mini kind of feel, and I'm not against that. I've always liked the look of those little computers. And so yeah, it feels really premium and also very sturdy because of that metal chassis. The next impression that I had is that we've got this little Beelink top logo right here on the top. And this is an older logo that we used to see a lot on their products, but we haven't seen it in quite some time. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of branding. I think this device is just so sleek on its own that this kind of takes away from the overall aesthetic. But as far as logos go, I don't really have any complaints about it, so I'm just being nitpicky at this point. Worst case scenario, you could probably just cover this up with a sticker like a lot of people do with MacBooks. Anyway, looking around at the rest of the device, we already have that front I/O that we talked about before, but one thing I did want to mention is that on each of the sides, there's just nothing. It's very plain on either end. So all your connectivity is going to come from either the front or the back, and I think that's a good design. Now, as far as cooling, everything is going to come from the bottom. There's a huge intake right here. And we also have these 4 little cosmetic nubs that are covering over the screw holes. Now, again, from a design perspective, I think that's pretty smart. After all, the rubber feet are what you can see at the top and the bottom. So those parts are going to keep the mini PC elevated over the ground so that we get good air circulation, and really these little rubber circles are just there for cosmetic reasons. With other companies, they often will use their rubber feet as their screw hole covers as well, which means that when you pull them off, you're going to remove the stickiness of them, and so I've never really liked that. Instead, I really like this Beelink design where they keep those two components separate. Another user-friendly feature I like with mini PCs from Beelink is that they always have a little flap on the bottom so that you can open it up pretty easily. And of course, we will do that here in a moment. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about the overall cooling and just the experience with it. Like I mentioned, on the bottom is the fan intake, so all the air will come up here, and then there's the exhaust on the back, and so that's where all the hot air is going to blow out. And they're calling this a new airflow design. You can see here where it's going to pull everything up and then push it to the back. And I do have to say that this entire setup is both very cool as well as super quiet. In all the testing that I did over the past month, it was very rare when I actually would notice that the mini PC was even working. And so if you are looking for a desktop solution that's going to be very quiet, then I think this is going to be right up your alley. Okay, let's do a quick teardown and take a look at the internal design as well. We just need to remove those 4 rubber feet, and then we have 4 different Phillips head screws. Once you pull off that back cover, you will see that they have a dust cover, and this is the first I've seen from this company as well. So the idea here is that this is going to trap the dust instead of getting it onto your components, so you can just clean this off instead of the components themselves. I haven't had the device long enough to be able to do long-term testing in this regard, but I do appreciate that they are thinking about this as well. We've got 2 additional screws to take off this dust cover, and now we can actually get to the components. We'll start by taking a look at the RAM, and I just want to confirm that yes, this is Crucial branded, and it's also running at 5600 megatransfers per second. Now to the right of that, we've got this big old heatsink, and this is covering up 2 different M.2 storage bays. One of them will already be populated with a 1 terabyte drive from Phison. This is also a pretty good hard drive company, and so I think the components here are pretty top notch. And then if you wanted to add a second M.2 drive, maybe for additional storage, or maybe you want to dual boot into Linux or Batocera, you can do that right here. And then finally, to the right of those 2280 bays, there's going to be another one for a 2230 slot. That's going to be for your Wi-Fi chip. And really, when it comes to user replaceable parts, that's exactly it. You can access all this stuff in case any of them fail or you want to make an upgrade. And below all of this is going to be all the cooling stuff. So I like the fact that we don't have to remove the fan or anything else like that to get to the components. I think this is a really good design. Okay, now considering this is a mini PC, you might be wondering about the size overall. So let's do a couple quick comparisons. We're going to start with an 8-ounce stick of Kerrygold grass-fed butter. This is the same thing I've been using in all these mini PC reviews as my standard of measurement. And you can see that it's about 2¼ sticks of Kerrygold butter, so a little bit on the small side overall when it comes to mini PCs. For a more practical example, here it is compared to an Xbox Series controller, which you can see is relatively around the same size. And for an even more practical shot, here it is on an actual desktop. To give you a sense of scale, this is a 24-inch monitor, so a little bit on the small side, and we're also looking at a 75% keyboard right here. So altogether, these are smaller components, but even then you can see that this mini PC is still relatively small by comparison. So in a nutshell, if you are tight on desktop space, then I think this is going to be an excellent fit because it is really small. The way I see it, this mini PC is really going to shine in 2 different ways. The first is if you plan on getting some sort of mini PC that you want to be very portable. For example, maybe you're on the road a lot and you want to have have a little PC that you can plug into like a hotel room TV to watch movies or play games, this is going to be great, especially because that power supply is still relatively small too. And then of course it's going to be a great fit on a smaller desktop. If you don't have a lot of space, but you want to make sure that your PC is right there within reach, this might be a great solution. Same thing if you wanted to put this under a TV and treat it like a mini gaming console, and we'll do something similar to that with an operating system called Batocera near the end of this video. Now I want to jump into testing, but before that I wanted to make one quick mention, and that is that my friend the Fox has made a video about this device already. And in terms of performance, he really gets into the weeds about how you can increase the TDP all the way up to 70 watts to get the best performance that you can. However, there are a couple caveats with that, and so I'm going to point you over to his video if you do happen to pick up this mini PC and you want to make sure that you're getting the best that you can in the safest way possible. Now for this test case that we're going to do in this video, I'm going to leave it at the default settings. This is what Beelink is calling the balanced preset, which is at a 45 watt TDP. And so in this video, we will focus on the out-of-box experience, and if you want to tweak it a little bit more, then check out the Fox's video instead. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start doing some testing. We'll start with kind of PC related tasks. First, I'm going to run Cinebench. So this is going to be a CPU intensive test. And there's a couple things that I'm checking here. Number one, I want to see what the power profile is going to look like when we put it to 100% load on the CPU. And you can see here that it's going to push all the way to 54 watts. And across the 10-minute test, it was stable at 54 the entire time. So there was no sort of throttling as the test went on. The other thing I like to monitor in this test is the overall temperature performance with the CPU. And you can see by the end of the test, the max temperature is 79 degrees Celsius, which is relatively cool when it comes to PC temperatures. Generally, I like to make sure that it stays within 90, and this is well below that. And so this is what I'm talking about in that the cooling in this machine is really excellent. It's not going to overheat at all. And then finally, once the test is completed, I did want to note that the CPU is pulling about 6 or 7 watts altogether when at idle. And for anybody who's concerned about numbers, I got a score of 926 with a multi-core score with the default settings. Now in terms of GPU intensive tests, I also did 3D Mark Time Spy, and the score here was 3300, which is about average for what I would expect with this generation chipset, so no surprises there. The graphics score is around 3000, which is what I would expect from the 780M, and then the CPU score is around 10,000. Again, this is a really beefy CPU, so that makes sense. So now let's do a couple other things related to video. We're going to do a 4K video playback first. So what I'm doing here is playing a 4K 60Hz video unscaled, and I'm getting about 5 drop frames right in the beginning, and then from then on it's completely stable. And so even after I played about 10,000 frames, those first 5 when I first hit play were the only ones that dropped. From then on, it was smooth as butter. This means to me that this is going to be an excellent mini PC for video encoding and playback. So for example, if you ever wanted to use this as a Plex server or any other sort of media server, it's going to be great. The other video test I like to do is to take one of my older videos, then chop it up and then try to re-encode it. So this time around, I'm taking a 4K video and I'm just going to take it and try to cut it down to 1 minute while moving all the parts around. And there's a couple things I'm testing here. The first is that I want to make sure DaVinci Resolve is going to be nice and snappy when playing around with 4K video. And yeah, it definitely is. The other thing I want to do is render it out to a different resolution. So this time I'm going to do 1080p and 30 frames per second. And when it comes to rendering, I've got a rule of thumb. If I'm going to be exporting to 1080p 60 frames per second, I expect that 1 minute of footage is going to take about 1 minute to render. And along those same lines, if we're going to do 30 frames per second, then I would expect it to be 30 seconds in order to render 1 minute of footage. So in the case of this video, which started at 4K 30 frames per second and now rendering down to 1080p 30 frames per second, I'm expecting it to be able to render 1 minute that's cut up with all sorts of titles and transitions to take about 30 seconds. However, when going through the test, it only took 16 seconds, so it's about twice as fast as I was hoping it would be. And so this is a good indication to me that this will be an excellent mini PC when it comes to video editing, especially with 1080p footage, but probably with 4K as well. So when it comes down to it, from everyday computer tasks, everything from browsing and shopping all the way up to video editing, I think this is going to hold its own. But of course, this is a gaming-centered channel, and so I really want to push the gaming side of things as well. Let's start moving into testing that first with PC games. So generally I like to test everything at 1080p and then mess around with the fidelity settings until I find a good balance. And I like to start with the lightweight games and then move my way up. And when it comes to lightweight games, you'll find that basically everything is going to play great. For example, really lightweight games like Balatro will play at 60 frames per second, 1080p no problem, and it's only going to require about a 10 watt TDP. It's a similar story with Animal Well. This one's a little bit more graphically and CPU intensive, but all the same, yeah, it's going to play absolutely fine, no problem. Now, if you want to play a lightweight game with the frame cap unlocked to see how many frames per second you can definitely push it as well. I was getting an average about 110 frames per second with Cult of the Lamb, and maybe an average about 200 frames per second with Hades. And that makes sense because this mini PC is kind of overkill when it comes to indie and lightweight games. So let's start moving things up, and we're going to start with what I call Xbox 360 era games. We'll start with BioShock Infinite playing at 1080p in very high settings, and I'm getting a stable 60 frames per second. This indicates to me that most of the games from this era are going to play absolutely fine. For another test, let's do Halo Reach at 1080p with the original or default settings, and here I'm going to push the frame cap all the way up to 120 frames per second, and surprisingly it hits that most of the time. So again, if you're looking for older era games, this is going to be great. Now for anyone who's looking into competitive shooters, let's test out Counter-Strike 2. We're going to do 1080p with a mixture of medium and low settings, and you can see that the average frame rate here is about 120 frames per second. I'm terrible at these games and I never play them, but I think that 120 frames sounds about right, and so I think this will be pretty good for games like this. Okay, now let's start pushing a little bit further into what I would call maybe PS4 era games instead, so one generation up. We'll start with Grand Theft Auto 3, an enduring classic. So this is a mixture of 1080p and high-medium settings, and the average frame rate I'm getting here is somewhere between 80 and 90 frames per second. So this is going to look great and also play super smooth as well. Another game that stays consistently above 60 frames per second is Doom Eternal. At 1080p and medium settings, this would be an excellent way to play this game. Moving on from there, we have Injustice 2, 1080p medium settings again, and this one is pretty stable at 60 frames per second. I saw it dip every once in a while, especially when there was a new move, but overall I would say this is going to be perfectly playable for most fighting games from this era as well. Another game that gives me pretty consistent 60 frames per second is Final Fantasy VII Remake. Here I'm playing at 1080p with high textures and low shadows. Now this is not a battle scene and I would fully expect this to dip down here and there, but at least when it comes to, the typical running around you do in this game, it should look really nice and also play pretty smoothly. Let's move on to a couple games that are a little bit more performance intensive. We'll start with Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. This one I'm playing at 1080p low settings, and I would say the average here is going to be between 40 and 50 frames per second. I think that's still fully playable, but you might want to just cap this out at 40 frames per second to have a very smooth experience. And the results will be very similar with Control, again at 1080p low settings, and we're seeing an average somewhere between 40 and 50 frames per second. For me personally, I think that anything above 30 with this game in particular, which has a bit of a cinematic edge to it, usually works really well. Moving on, let's try out Destiny 2. This is a game I'm playing at 1080p low settings, and one of my standards with this game personally is I like to get it to 60 frames per second. And we are actually very close to hitting that. I would say the average is between 55 and 60, but closer to 55 most of the time. For me, I think that I would probably just turn off the FPS in this one and just not pay attention to the fact that it's getting below 60 and enjoy it from there. However, there are ways to make sure you get a better frame rate, but it will come with a cost. Let's use Death Stranding as an example. This one is very similar to Destiny 2 in that at 1080p low settings, we're going to get an average about 55 frames per second. And probably the easiest solution here is to drop down the resolution to something a little bit less demanding so that we get better performance. Most of the time I would recommend 720p just because that's kind of a standard number, but 900p will also work really well. That's going to give you a slightly sharper image than 720p, and you'll still get a good performance boost. For example, with Death Stranding, after going to 900p in low settings, yeah, we're playing at 60 frames, completely stable. Let's do another test with Marvel's Spider-Man. So again here, 1080p low settings, and you can see the average is somewhere between 50 and 55 frames per second. And I think that performance is excellent and everything looks good. But if you want to make sure you get a little bit more frame rate, this is where you would add in that 900p resolution instead. And this will bump it up by about 5 frames per second. So instead of between 50 and 55, we're now getting between 55 and 60, and often closer to 60 most of the time. But admittedly, I would say that the image looks a little bit softer overall, so it's all going to be personal preference. And with some games, it probably won't matter that it's getting a full 60 frames per second. Baldur's Gate 3 is a great example. 1080p low settings will give me an average about 40 frames per second. And for me, that is perfectly playable and a really enjoyable experience. Same thing with God of War. Here I'm playing at 1080p low settings, but I did turn on FSR just slightly to the quality preset. And this will give me an average between 45 and 50. And for me personally, I think that anything over 40 is awesome. Honestly, honestly, even 30 frames per second is still playable in my book, and so yeah, this mini PC is more than capable of playing a game like this. Another test here is with Elden Ring. I'm just in the very beginning of the game, but you can see that I'm getting an average about 50 frames per second, which is still pretty good. Again, 1080p low settings, so not the greatest visuals in the world, but yeah, I would say this is super playable. And one of the nice things about this mini PC is it is pushing into the realm where you can make a choice between really nice graphics or a really high frame rate. Let's do another example with Cyberpunk 2077. This one will average somewhere between 35 and 45 frames per second at 1080p low settings. And I think it looks really good here, but it is a little bit slow and sluggish, all things considered. So it might be worth dropping down to 900p instead. This will give us a frame rate between 45 and 55 frames per second, so not quite 60, but still a lot snappier. Even when in a big fight scene like this ruckus that I started right here with all the police, it's still staying well above 45 frames per second. So I think what I would do here is probably just cap it at 40 frames per second, which is going to be a lot more stable and still a lot smoother than 35 or 30 frames per second. Either way, I could definitely see myself playing through Cyberpunk 2077 with these settings. So I think when it comes down to it, when talking about PC games, I think that most games will probably play at 1080p, but probably low settings. And I think that'll make all the games playable at least at 30 frames per second, but you might be surprised how many will go up from there. And if you're looking for a more stable experience, something closer to 60 frames per second, then dropping it down to 900p is a good compromise. Long story short, when it came to PC games, no matter what I tested it with, they all were playable, at least at 30 frames per second, if not better. So things are looking great on the PC gaming side. Let's now switch over to emulation. And because we're talking about a somewhat high-end mini PC, we're going to start with the good stuff and move our way up. So starting here with GameCube, we're going to push everything up to a 4x resolution, which is going to be 1440p. And sure enough, every single game that I tried, even the harder to run games like F-Zero GX, were playing at full speed. So I'm comfortable in saying as long as compatibility is not an issue, you'll be able to play GameCube at 1440p resolution, if not better. Moving on, let's try out PS2. I used the exact same settings, so 4x resolution, again, well above 1440p. And even with this upscale, all the games that I tried, including the harder to run games like God of War 2, were again playing at full speed. So in terms of these two Gen 6 consoles, yeah, absolutely great. Let's stick with Gen 6 for one more console. That's going to be the original Xbox. And here, as expected with Windows, we are going to get some mixed performance. To start, there are going to be games that play at a 2x resolution, including Dead or Alive 3, and it looks great. But in order to get the vast majority of the games that I tried to play at a full speed, I did have to drop it down to a native resolution. It will make the game look a little bit chunkier, but also very nostalgic. However, it is worth noting that it's not going to be a perfect experience with this emulator and this PC, and that's pretty typical at this price point. For example, Midtown Madness 3 does play at full speed, but you get a little bit of graphics issues, for example the shadows underneath the car. So it's not a perfect experience, and this might be a compatibility thing with this ROM and this emulator. However, even from just a purely performance standpoint, like with Project Gotham Racing, this one is not playing at full speed. So when it comes to emulating Xbox on Windows, as expected, we are going to see some flaws here and there. We will come back to this system later, but under Linux, so let's move on to the next console. Let's move up one generation to Nintendo Wii U. So here I'm playing Wind Waker HD 1080p resolution, and as expected, this is playing great. This is a console that is pretty easy to emulate, especially on this chipset. Let's really push it to Breath of the Wild, which is going to be the hardest Wii U game to play, and I'm also going to increase the resolution to 1080p from the standard 720. And here you can see I'm getting an average frame rate of about 45, maybe 50 frames per second. And of course, this is a worst case scenario in the heat of a battle. But even then, you can see that it's well above 30 frames per second at all times, which means you're not going to get any actual slowdown. It might just get a little bit less smooth as you're playing. Either way, I would be very comfortable playing this game with these settings. Let's move on to another console. Let's do PS3. So this one I'm going to play everything in a native resolution and kind of work our way up to the harder to play games. When it comes to light and even medium weight games like Dead or Alive 5 and Mirror's Edge, these are all playing really well. When we push it up to 3D based games, things like Prince of Persia, even when turning on the 60 frames per second patch, it actually gets very close to 60 frames per second almost the entire time. And this really is no surprise because even 7000 series CPUs did really well with PS3 emulation. Another example is going to be Infamous. This one stays well above 30 frames per second, so it's going to be a nice smooth experience. And from a speed perspective, I would say that God of War 3 is also very playable. There are going to be some graphical artifacts, especially when it comes to shadowing, which is very typical with this game and why it's not considered to be fully playable. And that has more to do with the emulator in the game itself than the actual performance of this chipset. Either way, what I would say is that as long as the game is compatible with the emulator, you're probably going to be able to play it with this mini PC. It's going to be a similar story with Xbox 360 emulation as well. Again, we're going to play things at a native resolution, and even some of the harder games to play like Crackdown and Forza Horizon, these are playing just great, and so I do think that as long as compatibility is going to work with the emulator, you'll mostly be able to play all Xbox 360 games that work on this machine. And then finally, let's do one modern system, and this is going to be Nintendo Switch, and we're using the latest Sudachi emulator before it got taken down. Again, this is just a hardware test, so I'm not condoning any sort of Nintendo Switch emulation, but I did want to show how the performance looks. Here, I'm going to play everything at the native 1x resolution, but then keep it in docked mode, which is going to be 1080p for most games. And again, performance here is in line with what I would expect with a 7000 and 8000 Ryzen CPU. So for the most part, I would say that Nintendo Switch games are going to be fully playable even in docked mode. You might get a couple stutters here and there as we have shaders compiling, but after that, it's going to be a very smooth gameplay experience. There are going to be some outliers like Tears of the Kingdom that won't play at full speed all the time, but I think you're still going to have a good experience with this system. Okay, next I want to test out Batocera. This is a Linux-based operating system that I have loaded up on an external hard drive. And I've made videos about this before. I'll leave one linked down below that'll walk you through this entire setup. Either way, all I'm going to do here is go into recovery options, then boot it from that hard drive instead. And then I'm just going to kind of use the magic of television to fast forward into the actual menu interface. Either way, I did want to show that yes, this will boot into Batocera. I didn't have to fiddle around with BIOS or anything. And so let's do a little bit of testing here on the Linux side just to see how performance is going to fare versus some of the other Windows emulators. And the one I'm thinking of the most is the original Xbox emulator. This one runs a lot better in Linux for some reason. And I found that some games that I could only play at a native resolution, I can now play at a 2x resolution here under Batocera. Even games that weren't playing at full speed at a native resolution, like this Panzer Dragoon game, can now play at 2x and they're playing great. And so if you do want to play original Xbox games, the solution here is going to be to play them via Batocera. I also did a little bit of testing with Nintendo 3DS just to confirm that yes, everything's going to play great both on Windows and Batocera at a 4x resolution. And so the big draw here is if you wanted to set this up with Batocera, you could put it in the additional M.2 storage bay, or of course you could just boot it from an external drive like me. And then you can plug this into a TV and you would have a retro gaming console just like that. And so if you are looking for a mini PC solution to put under your TV where you can swap between retro gaming as well as PC games on the fly, this might be a great solution. Anyway, that's really about it for the testing. Now let's move into the summary part and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the SER8. As always, we'll start with the positives, and I really like how solid and sleek this mini PC is. I really like that it has that metal body to it. It just looks really sharp. In addition, I'm really happy with the I/O, especially the placement of it. I think that everything is exactly where I want it to be. Additionally, in terms of performance, I think that everything runs really well. Every single PC game that I played was playable, and everything that I tried to emulate was pretty great too. Another thing I love is that the mini PC stays very cool. In fact, most of the time you don't even hear any sort of fan, and when you do, it's got a pretty pleasant sound to it as well. So I think it is going to be a nice companion right there on your desktop. It's not going to be too loud. Another thing I like about it is that some components are adjustable. You have 2 different M.2 slots, and you can also upgrade the RAM to get even more if you'd like. In fact, I think the machine is capable of up to 128 gigs of RAM if you really want to push it. And finally, I found this to be a very Linux-friendly PC. I didn't have to do anything special to boot into Linux other than to just use a bootable drive. Now, as always, I like to nitpick some of the things I don't like about it, and I have to be honest, I kind of struggled finding bad things with this one. Even then, I do have a couple things I want to bring up. The first is that if I had a wish list, I would add a couple more USB ports onto the machine. Another thing worth mentioning is that I wish the 100 watt power supply was 120 watts instead. And a lot of that has to do with the issues that Fox brought up in his review, which I'll have linked down below. Essentially, he found that in terms of heat and cooling, he can push this up to a 70 watt TDP. However, the total system power actually goes up to around 80 watts of total power. And as he explains in his video, you don't really want to push it over the 80 and 20 rule when it comes to a power supply. And so pushing it beyond 80 watts consistently will cause degradation to your power supply. And I think this could have been mitigated if they just used a 120 watt power supply instead. Because after all, this machine is more than capable of pushing up the power limits to that. And then finally, one of the things I always like to bring up when we're talking about some of the more expensive mini PCs is that once you get to around $650, you have other options out there. Of course, you could always build your own PC from scratch and you might be able to get something pretty awesome at around $650. But just bear in mind that you will have to deal with a full desktop tower, and that's not really what we're going for here with a mini PC. However, one solution worth discussing are laptops, because these often will have the very same chips that we're seeing right here. So just as a quick example, I went out to Best Buy, looked at what laptops were on sale, and I found this one for $700, so $50 more than the SER8. And this one is also using a Ryzen 7 8000 series CPU. It doesn't specify which one, but I assume the performance is going to be very similar to what we saw in this video. It does have a little bit less RAM, it's only 16 gigabytes, but it has a terabyte of storage. In addition, it's going to have a screen and a keyboard and a battery, and it's going to be a lot more portable to take around. And so one thing to keep in mind, if you're just looking for bang for your buck and the most diversity and value that you can get, sometimes a laptop on sale will be a better bet. However, if you're just looking for something very small to put on your desktop or maybe under your TV, then I think that the SER8 is an excellent value. And so even though, yes, you can find laptops that might be able to get the job done, when it comes to this form factor in particular, this is one of my favorites. In fact, if you look at my mini PC spreadsheet, which I'll also leave linked down below, this is a list of all the mini PCs I've tested over the 4 years of this channel. And you can see I've made a couple changes here now that I've added the SER8. When it comes to the $650 price point, this is now my recommended system. You can definitely find machines that are more powerful, but I think just the overall combination of things like the cooling and the I/O and just the overall look of it makes this one my favorite right now. And as you can see below that price point, I don't have any recommendations because once you get past $650, it gets a little bit hard to justify that price point. But I think for the price, the SER8 is in a Goldilocks space. It's got all the things that I want in a mini PC. It looks really good, it's got the I/O in the right places, and the performance is excellent for the price. In fact, now that I've been testing it for over a month, I've decided to make this one my main PC in the studio. And I very rarely swap these PCs out, so that is saying a lot. So at the end of the day, if you're asking whether or not I recommend this device, it really is going to depend upon you. Are you in the market for a mini PC, and are you within the budget of $650? If so, when it comes to this form factor, I think this is an excellent solution. And so yeah, I give it a hearty recommendation as long as the shoe fits. And it's kind of crazy how good these mini PCs have become over the years, and I'm really even more excited about Strix Point PCs when they start coming out next year. As it stands in terms of 2024, I think that this is probably the mini PC within this price category that's the one to beat. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Is this the one for you, or would you rather get something a little bit more on the budget side on Amazon? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.